Okay. Last class we finished Kashrut and now Roman numeral 5. Okay. This is called kosher speech. Okay. So there are a number of mitzvot that pertain to speaking, and I'd say these are when there are communities that take these seriously, it actually feels different. It can really transform what a community is about, what it feels like, what it feels to be in a community. So these are halachot with real, I think, ethical valence. Okay, so there's a prohibition against slander, but that actually, there would be 3 stages along the slander spectrum. The first is not on the list. The first is called richilut. Richilut. Seems like the etymology is like a rochel is like merchants, right? So richilut is like, it's sort of gossip, like when you take information, like you use information with other people, like something that you trade back and forth with somebody else, so richilut is anything about someone else that there's no reason to say. Right? So we shouldn't engage in that kind of talk about other people. There's no reason to talk about them. Just, we should be talking about events, we should be talking about ideas, not about other people. And then there's a quick, great people talk about ideas, mediocre people talk about events, and lowly people talk about other people. Okay? It's more elevating not to talk about other people if there's no reason to. So that's richilut. Richilut is, again, just sort of gossip, sharing information that the listener has no need to know. It's a lot of conversation in many circles. So certain circles is that kind of talk. It's really can be best avoided. Second level is lashon hara. Lashon hara is information about others which is derogatory and damaging and true. So that could be so-and-so is a terrible temperer, so-and-so is a terrible cook, so-and-so smells bad, so-and-so is really lazy, so-and-so was fired from their job for incompetence, whatever it might be. It's true. It is derogatory or damaging. It's going to be damaging without being derogatory, probably. In certain circumstances, right? So you have to think about the impact of what you're going to say. Could it be harmful to the subject that you're talking about? Or even if you don't see how it could be harmful, if it's derogatory, just negative about somebody else, that kind of speech is called lashon hara, and it's also forbidden. So it's true, and also it is derogatory or damaging. The third level, the most severe, is motzi shemra. Motzi shemra is what we would call pure slander. That's saying something untrue about someone else. So that, maybe is obviously wrong. I think we understand, intuitively why saying lies about someone, motzi shemra, is bad. Lashon hara, true things about somebody, that's also derogatory or damaging. That's less obviously bad, but I think it still has a corrosive impact on, on society anyway. Now there is a phrase called l'toelet, which means for a purpose, and if something is for a purpose, then it can and really ought to be shared. And I think that's also the flip side of all these rules. There are prohibitions against sharing this kind of information under certain circumstances, but in other circumstances, this information needs to be shared. So toilet, there's a need for the person to hear it. So would be an example of that? Can you think of an example of what that might be?
I was gonna say, if a close friend's parent passed away and that their other close friend doesn't know, but I don't know if they need to know that, but more to
Yeah, so that would be right. So you're sharing something that wouldn't be lashon hara, because that's not derogatory or damaging. That might be richilut. Otherwise, you're sharing something about somebody, but you're doing it for a reason. The reason is you want to you're trying to organize help. You're trying to get solidarity and sympathy for this person from your network, and so that's why you're sharing.
It was warning.
So
if someone is going to do business with somebody else,
Right.
and something that's true, but
listen, I saw you're interviewing for a job with Harold. You should know that the last person on that job quit after not being paid for 3 months, and you should just be aware of what you're going to, right? That's derogatory and damaging information, but you can share it because there's a toilet, there's a purpose in the information being told. Not to broadcast it widely, but to tell this person who has a reason to know it. And so both sides of that balance are really important. I mean, if people are overly cavalier in sharing negative information, that can really just, again, corrode trust and solidarity amongst people. But if you are too cautious about sharing information that needs to be shared, then people who are very harmful and dangerous can continue to damage others without anything stopping them. So both sides really need to be of that equation. Both sides of the balance needs to be maintained.
What about, question about that. I think it's also a matter of perspective, right? And let's say that there's something that is true. I mean, true is something that everybody agrees that is true. Like somebody is such and such, and from from my perspective is like לתועלת, and from the other person's perspective is לשון הרע.
For example, so what's an example?
Like for example, let's say that somebody is interviewing for a job, and I tell his boss that he's such and such, and I don't think he's good for the job. And I'm actually thinking that I'm doing this person a favor, that I'm helping him not get a job, for example, right? Just as one example. So how do you balance it?
Yeah, I think if your prime responsibility is to the potential employer, meaning I don't.
It's more about, my question is more about like, is it from my perspective, is it, do I measure it from my perspective, is it לשון הרע, or from the other person's perspective that I'm talking about?
It's the person you're telling to. Does the person who's receiving the information have a need for this information? So I'm about to hire somebody, so I deserve, your unbiased, your sort of fair, free opinion about this, this potential hire. I'm dating somebody, whatever, I'm bringing my dry cleaning somewhere, like you have a right, so that's information, I'm in a situation where I need to know information about this person. I'll be damaged if I don't know, I'll be harmed if I don't have information about this other person that you have. So share that information, but in a limited way as possible, so that I can then make the choice about, okay, I won't bring my clothes to this dry cleaner, I won't date this person, I won't hire this person. But you don't have to, but yeah, I mean, the person you say bad things about may be very upset. I mean, if they knew, they would be very upset. That's okay. That doesn't mean that there isn't a need for it to be a purpose, a value when you tell them. It's complicated, like it's not, I don't know, you could, there's a famous book written nearly 100 years ago, about 100 years ago, called Chavetz Chaim, which goes through these rules in great detail, and all sorts of subcategories and clauses and exceptions, and I don't know how successful that book is. I mean, like trying to take this category of Jewish law and making it like something that you could codify in a precise way, because I think a lot of it's going to depend on the specific relationship and the specific situation, which is always going to be just different, and right. So so this is always going to be a challenge. There's a book that was just published. I should put it on the list here. There's a book, Daniel Feldman just published a book about updating these laws for an internet age, right, where people share all sorts of things about themselves in public, and people say all sorts of things about other people anonymously, and like how do you like share information that needs to be shared? How do you expose corruption and crime and abuse in a way that also maintains this sort of ethical sensitivity that like someone else's reputation is like worth protecting. My default is not share information because other people's reputations and their welfare, their good name is something that I want to protect. Again, except for those cases where I need to protect others, right? So it's hard. So I read part of that book. It looks like a very intelligent book. Daniel Feldman is his name, and he's a very clever guy, and it looks like a very valuable book. But I think in the end, there can be a lot of judgment calls. There's also something called avat lashon hara, the dust of lashon hara, which is to say something good about somebody in the presence of their enemies, or the presence of those who are a little more cynical about them, because then you're going to cause them to say something bad about them. I know that happens to me a lot. People, whenever anybody is effusively praised, and I feel they don't deserve the praise, I feel a strong, wow, they're not so great. I don't think they're so great. right? I'm not proud of that. I know that myself. I can't tolerate somebody being praised effusively if I don't think they deserve it. I have to take them down a notch. I have to say, yeah, but they weren't able to solve this problem, or yeah, but this person really doesn't like them, or yeah, that's what everyone thinks about them, but that's not my perspective, right? So just say even something positive about somebody in a situation that's going to lead to a cynical backlash. That's called a backlash now. So it's best, maybe to avoid talking about other people. I remember this very clearly. I was with, yes, I remember that clearly. I remember when I was with my first year in yeshiva. I was hanging out with some friends. We were talking about other people in a way that was failing to live up to these standards. And one of our friends said, "Listen, guys, this is not right to talk this way." And we just, all of us stopped in our tracks. We changed the conversation. Nobody, to me, it didn't seem like anyone felt awkward about the situation. It was resentful, and right, just, oh yeah, right, somebody called us, one of the group said, let's not talk this way, and we just shift gears right away. It was I guess my really special moment, what it is to be in a culture that kind of takes it seriously. My grandmother used to always would say, Lashon Hara, she would interrupt herself. She would talk about such and such, oh, Lashon Hara, I can't say. I should say, Schwartz, oh, Lashon Hara. Just raise topics and then stop herself. Okay. That's letter A. Okay, any more questions about that? Reactions or?
No, it makes sense. It's definitely something that is very dynamic and relevant in how to, because as you said, it's something that is very hard to qualify, and it's relevant to any relationship between Jews and non-Jews, everyday life between people. So it's I face it.
Yeah, there's sort of one other exception that there's I think I've heard people say, and it makes a lot of sense to me, that there's sort of a free speech zone between a husband and wife for the sake of a certain you're allowed to vent to your spouse. Again, which other contexts might be Lashon Hara, my boss, or my always on my case, oh my God, her perfume is awful. I can't stand my boss's perfume. It's crazy. Oh, why she? Can't take it, right? So that under other contexts, that would be Lashon Hara, right? Because it's derogatory or damaging. It's true, but it's derogatory or damaging. There's no need for the other person to hear that information. So that would be Lashon Hara. But there's a psychological need for sort of to vent, also for a certain intimacy within the marital relationship, and so there are some who say that it's a free speech zone in their marriage. Again, I think it's still debasing if all you do as a couple is talk about other people. I don't think that's you would aspire to more than that, right? But that's balanced with again trying to create intimacy and also giving people a framework which they can vent, and I think maybe also people who aren't married, I think you could say maybe to a close friend, listen, it's really important to me that I'm going to vent right now. I just kind of have to, that may be a toilet for the speaker. And the listener is in a bind then, because the speaker has a toilet to listen, to sort of vent. I don't know why the listener doesn't have a toilet to hear, but maybe the listener is okay, you can vent. The listener says, well, I'm not going to believe everything you say. Or you're going to vent, and I understand, I'm just not going to believe what you say, because I understand you need to share this information, and that's important, even though I'm not so. So just I'll let you vent, and I'll just sort of reserve judgment, withhold judgment on the people you're talking about.
By the way, those rules, as I said, always I think relevant between people. When they were written, and I don't know where they come from. I guess not from the Torah, but from the.
Yeah, the Torah discusses some of these categories, but very obliquely, and the Talmud develops them a little bit more. In the medieval halachic legal sources discuss some others, but you find it really it become in the 20th century, early 20th century, the Rabbi, the Cohen, Kagan, the Chavetz Chaim really made this his thing and wrote a book about it where he defined, delineated, and he made a campaign to kind of emphasize these rules. So they're old, but they were kind of given a push, in the 20th century.
And I assume they're relevant to any Jew facing any other person, right?
Yeah.
Jew, and
you're correct,
Jew is
yes.
a Jew.
And it also applies to groups. You can't say you couldn't. Lashon Hara could also be applied against, people. people in Pittsburgh, they talk funny, that would be like Lashon Hara against Pittsburgh, like you can, it also, and there's stories in the Torah about Lashon, Miriam is smitten with, she speaks saying badly against Moshe, and then she's smitten with this kind of skin condition, kind of skin leprosy, and that seems to be a punishment, biblical punishment for Lashon Hara. And we see that also earlier, Moshe also gets it. He says something bad about the Jewish people in the beginning of Exodus, and he gets this leprosy as well. So they don't believe me, so God says, put your hands inside your clothing and bring it out, and it's also covered in this leprous mark. So it seems that in the Torah itself, there's a linkage between Lashon Hara and this type of skin affliction, which also has a sort of symbolic meaning about superficiality versus interiority, and you could develop that. Right?
Mhm.
However, the Torah has a couple of cases, 2, 3 cases of what in English we often call white lies, which is a lie made for the sake of peace. Classic example is God tells Avram and Sarah that Sarah's going to have a son, and Sarah laughs and says, "How can I have a son? Because," what'd she say? She laughs, how could I have a son? Because
God left her.
Because she laughs, yes, but she says because, how could I have a son? Because
She's old.
She doesn't say that, she says because my husband is old. And then God tells Abraham, Sarah is laughing, saying, how could I have a child? Because I am so old. So when God tells Abraham, he changes the story. And the rabbis notice this shift and say, oh, look, it seems you're allowed to lie in order to make peace. So, does this sweater make me look fat? The answer is no. Okay, you can lie for the sake of peace. Again, it's risky. It's risky because sometimes the lie is discovered, and then it's worse than if you had just told the truth to begin with. And is your motivation to make peace, or is your motivation something more self-serving? But I'd say truth here is, truth is like the little truth is the big truth. The big truth is that people are supposed to get along with each other and live together in peace. And there's like the little truth about whatever the issue under discussion is. And the bigger truth is that we should get along. So change your words to coincide, to align with the type of statement that will enable and facilitate us all to get along. Because that's like the real truth on a deeper level. So we can lie for truth. We can lie for the sake of peace. Now, Torah speaks about a prohibition called ona'ah. We're now letter C, if you're following along. Ona'ah literally means oppression. And extra questions about lying for peace? Ona'ah is literally means oppression. It has two meanings in the Talmud, or in the Torah. It's a word from the Torah. The Talmud says there are two meanings. One is financial ona'ah, which is charging too much money, selling something for too much money, or paying too little for something. The Talmud assumes there's a fair market price, some objective price for any object, and if you take more than your profits are too high, or you buy something at too big a discount, you're defrauding the other person. Okay, this seems to be a little hard to understand this in light of modern economics, right? Because I discussed it, the big, chiddush of the big innovative, clever idea, from what I understand, of modern economics. I think this is Adam Smith who thought of this, that, I can sell you widgets at $10 a widget, and I'm making money, and it's profitable for me, and you are buying widgets at $10 a widget, and you're also making money, and it's profitable for you. But there's a price that exists, which both of us are better off. Somehow, I can sell you something, and you can buy something, and at the end of that transaction, we're both better off and wealthier than we were before. Because you're buying the widget for $10 because it's worth more than $10 to you, and I'm selling it for you for $10 because it's worth, I made it for less than that, right? And like everyone benefits from that transaction. I think that idea is somewhat counterintuitive. It had to be discovered in the 17th century or 18th century, and before it was discovered, people didn't know that. So the Talmud, I think, seems to think that there is more sort of like there's more of an objective price, And in any transaction, there's a winner and there's a loser. So you can't take too much profit, because that's oppression, that's fraud. You're defrauding somebody if you sell something for more than it's worth, and if you pay less than something's worth, you're defrauding the seller. So there's some. I don't think that's entirely a foreign idea. It's even in a modern economy, you have situations where markets are imperfect markets, or circumstances where somebody can defraud somebody else by taking advantage of somebody's lack of full information, taking advantage of somebody's desperation, or convincing somebody to buy something they don't need, or there are. I think fraud is still a concept that is relevant, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than in a classic understanding.
Just to build on that, because that's kind of like
what you do.
What I do.
Yeah.
Part of the idea, by the way, is you're absolutely right. So if you want to become an economist at some point, let me know.
Okay.
But the idea is completely right, and this is something that is much more relevant to the last 200 years, I would say, because look at the camera. In order to make it, you need a lot of people. You need to create some kind of a professionalism and to create some kind of efficiency. 500 years ago, what they sold is like wheat and potatoes, things that are very, very basic. So in a way, you did have something that is much closer to something that is like an absolute price.
I see.
Today, to create a camera, for me and you, it will take like so many hours and time, etc. For the professional guy, it will take much less time and resources. But he'll buy from you some other things that you are like a professional in, like, I don't know, like your knowledge, for example. This is something that, again, for the camera maker, will take a lot of time to get to the same professionalism as you are. So there's much more room for equilibrium.
Fascinating. That's interesting. So it's not just the idea; it's also then as the economy develops, that dynamic is more true. That's interesting. Okay, that's interesting. Anyway, then, so whatever. So like these are the circumstances where somebody could defraud someone else. I'm telling you it's worth more than it really is. I'm taking advantage of your naivete. I'm using deceptive marketing tactics. All these things that companies do to make you buy things you don't need. And
there's a specific percentage that we're talking about?
So in the Talmud it's 20%. 20% above, and you can undo a sale. If I sell you something and I get more than 20% above the market rate, you can come back to me when you discover that and the sale's undone. Like similarly, if you buy it for 20% less than the market rate, I can come back and undo the sale. Because like one of us was defrauded, the sale is undone. So but again, it'd be hard to apply. You have to think of a circumstance of what's fair market rate. How would you know what's the fair market rate of something other than what a free buyer and free seller agreed to sell something for? Unless I can convince you that it's, I could convince you. Like price gouging, and there's surge pricing. There's a hurricane, so I'll sell you a generator for $1,000. Was that? I don't know. That might be a case where this applies as well.
Is that like 20% net? We're talking about after tax, does it matter, or?
I don't remember. We can look it up. There are books. You can buy books about this. I think that's straightforward. Profit too high, profit too low. Taylor Dan is going to be less applicable in a free market economy where it's hard to determine. Well, how would you determine what the objective price is? It's not profit. It's profit margin can be as high or low as. It's not the profit margin. It's 20% more than the objective fair price. So that would be hard to determine for many things, I would think. The other form of onah, however, there's also onat verbim, there's also verbal oppression, and this is, the Talmud gives an example, of reminding somebody that their parents were scoundrels, or reminding somebody that someone's, had a dark history, to remind them of their history. So you're not supposed to tell someone who converts to Judaism about that they used to worship idols. You're not supposed to have somebody whose parents were highwaymen and were hanged. Don't use the word hang in their presence. Even when you talk about fish, don't say, look at those fish hanging, on the string there in the presence of somebody whose parents were hanged. In other words, it's sort of like being PC. Don't use words that are going to be triggering or painful for somebody based on their particular background in their presence. It's like words can be painful, don't use painful words. And those painful words are specific to the individual you're talking to and their history. That's the case of the fish. That's in the Talmud, right? Don't say, look at those fish hanging there if you're talking to somebody who has a relative who was hanged by the government, okay, as executed that way. Don't use that word. I think there's a certain like mocking of PC language, that some people engage in, but and I sort of get the mock. It sort of sounds a little bit silly, like just call a thing a thing, like why don't like it can be sort of there's something farcical about it, I guess, like the use of PC, of quote unquote PC language, but actually what it's about is a desire not to offend people, not to cause people pain in your speech, and that's actually a very important ethical principle. It doesn't matter if they should or if they're overly sensitive, like if it's causing them pain, just don't talk that way. There's a line that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter used to say. He was a rabbi of the 19th century in Lithuania, and he said, somebody else's gashmiut is my ruchniut, meaning somebody else's physical well-being is my spiritual well-being, meaning it's my religious task, my spiritual undertaking, my spiritual growth comes from ensuring that you are taken care of physically, that you're well-fed and clothed, a roof over your head, so your mundane physical comfort, ensuring that exists, that's my spiritual quest. So that's your social ledger. My modification, my twist of that is somebody else's mishugas is my ruchniut. Accommodating somebody else's nuttiness and craziness and irrationality is also like that's my spirituality. So, meaning somebody else is scared of spiders. So don't say that's ridiculous, spiders are harmless, get over it. Say, okay, I'm going to make sure that you're not in distress and pained and frightened by spiders by making sure that you don't encounter spiders. Right? Somebody else has sensitivity around certain words and certain chunks, so I won't talk that way in their presence. Okay, why are we going? The point is not to say, oh, get over it, have a thicker skin. No, because my job, my growth as a human being and refinement as a human being is accommodating somebody else's nuttiness and irrationality and mishugas. Okay, next. I have a series of mitzvot. Any questions? Sorry, I'm speaking fast and going to a lot of different topics. Reactions or? Okay. I have a series of mitzvot that relate to our relationship to others and their sins. They're doing something wrong. So the simplest case would be, I think, Lifnei Iver, which in the Torah verses Lifnei Iver lo titin michshol, do not place a stumbling block before the blind. Okay, right? Meaning, what's the image? It's the image of this blind person is helpless in this particular aspect, and you're going to cause him to stumble. So that was understood, that was expanded by the rabbis in the Talmud to mean first of all, don't give someone bad advice. Second of all, don't enable someone else to sin. And the Talmud limits this to a case of two, they're like, there's a river and you and this other guy are on two different sides of the river, and there's a little rope, like pulley system between the sides of the river, and you have some, non-kosher food on your side, and he's on the other side, and he says, pass that sandwich to me. So you put the sandwich in the basket, and you pass it over to him. That is lifnei iver lo titin michshol. That is putting a stumbling block before the blind, because you are enabling him to sin. If you hadn't put the sandwich in the basket and sent it over, would you have been able to eat it? No. Right? What if you're on the same side of the river, and he says, can you pass me that sandwich? So, if you do, that's not lifnei iver. That's not this biblical prohibition of enabling, because he could get it anyway, even if you didn't, okay? So what would be cases? So some cases like that, some cases like that. Again, somebody, I don't know, it's like inviting somebody to join you, inviting somebody to have a Shabbat meal with you. you know they're going to drive on Shabbat to come get to your house. What do you think about that?
You're gonna drive them?
No, but you're inviting them and they'll come drive to you.
Oh, and they'll drive to you.
Yeah, meaning you have friends and family, you know they drive on Shabbat. You invite them to a Shabbat meal, knowing if they'll drive. Can the synagogue send out a newsletter advertising programming to people who live a couple miles away, knowing that they're going to drive? Isn't that enabling others to sin?
Mhm.
Is it or is it not?
Yeah.
Yes, it's all enabling. It shouldn't be that forbidden. You can't invite someone to your house, they're going to drive because it's enabling to sin. Does that everyone agree?
Not necessarily.
No.
No,
Okay.
I don't
Right, right, right,
If
right.
they would drive, they could, if they're somebody who drives on Shabbat, then they do that to go other places, whether or not you told them to. You're not like removing an obstacle from them driving. I don't know.
But it's mitzvah l'shem avirat, so it's kind of tricky.
Let's focus on this one. Just think it's a mitzvah that comes through sin, so it's kind of tricky. We'll get, not exact, maybe. But just focusing on lifnei iver, I think you're right. I mean, there's some who prohibit this, there's some who permit it. So it's amongst living rabbis, or the last 100 years. There's all different opinions on this question, and personally, I think the more lenient position makes the most sense. Although I have a lot of pull in the other direction as well. It's not a straightforward issue for a number of reasons, but I think you're right. Essentially, they could drive anyway. They don't need you to drive. You're not enabling them to drive just by giving them an invitation, because they could drive without the invitation.
I think also, and I struggled a lot with this, like when I just, my whole family's not are not observant, and there was just, I came back from, living an observant life for 6 months in Israel, and I moved back, and it was like, no one kept Shabbat, I ate vegetarian, but our house wasn't kosher, and I met a rabbi in Israel who said, like, you can't eat your mom's cooking, it's not kosher, and you can't, you need to go live alone somewhere where you can keep Shabbat, and all this stuff, and I was like, I felt like it was cutting off my nose to spite my face, rather than being able to be with family, and, in that situation, should I sit home alone on Shabbat, or drive somewhere so I can be with a community of people and celebrate Shabbat? You know what I mean? There's kind of that,
That's the opposite question. That's the opposite perspective. That's the perspective of the driver, not the invitee.
Right.
Invitor, that's invitee. I think that question would be different depending on how old you are and your circumstance in life. I think you're talking about a 16-year-old who wants to keep Shabbat, and if they're going to be alone, until they graduate high school. That's not really realistic. Versus an adult who maybe could make arrangements to spend Shabbat elsewhere, or could spend a day with family but at home and not drive. I think it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're making an invitation, though, I think there's it could be very powerful for somebody, very positive if you invite them to your home for Shabbat. And those who permit it, they say you have to give them an option to stay over.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say, listen, you could say, we'd like you to come. Please come just for dinner Friday night, and then at dinner you can say, listen, you don't have to leave. If you want to stay, we can, you're welcome to stay. Or when you call them, listen, please come for dinner. If you want to spend Shabbat, let us know. We can find you a place. You can stay in our guest bedroom, or we'll find you a place to stay with the neighbors. So I think that's so those who permit say, you don't again, because if there's no possibility of them staying over, and if you're not open to them staying over, that's not part of the invitation, at least implicitly or implicitly, then you really are saying, because of my invitation, you're going to have to drive to me, and you have to drive home. Because of, so. These are tricky questions, right? What if your friend asks to borrow $5 to buy a pack of cigarettes?
On Shabbat, or just in general?
In general, I don't know. We're supposed to preserve our health. I think cigarette smoking is certainly frowned. If it's not an outright prohibition, it's pretty close to it. It probably is. If there are a lot of Jews who smoke, but I think it's probably should be forbidden because it's tells us we should protect our health, and this is a pretty blatant way in which we don't.
But it can lead to other questions, like there's some people that need to smoke to kind of get focused and getting even to a class, you know what I mean?
Okay.
It's like, there's no limit to that, that's the problem, so you just
Right,
let
okay.
it go too much and then there's no limit to what can be done.
Right, it's complicated. What if somebody says, can I have a glass of water? And you don't think they're going to say a bracha before they drink the water.
I think that falls under the same category we talked about before, where like they're able to say it and you're not keeping them from it, or I don't know.
But if you don't give them the water, they won't, like drinking or eating anything without saying a bracha is forbidden. You're giving them the water. They're going to drink it.
But isn't that saying the same as like sitting on the same side of the river? Like they could just as easily stand up, get the glass of water themselves.
Let's say they're a guest in your house.
Gets to my house, I tell them to help themselves.
If you're supposed to preserve health too, and they're thirsty and they need water, is that true as well?
Okay, good. Okay, so this question was dealt with by Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, dealt with this question, and he said that if you were to say no to this guy who asked for water, the result would be they would come to hate Jews and hate the Torah and hate mitzvot, and that would be even worse for them. Okay, and even worse for their just religious outlook on life. And so, even though in this moment they're doing something forbidden by drinking water, if you were to deny them the water, the outcome, the long-term impact on their religious life would be so much worse. Give them water. Be nice to people. Okay.
I feel like that's the same thing with the driving.
Yeah, I think so too. Right? In other words, you make the invitation, you open your home to different kinds of people, you let them experience what Shabbat is like and how joyful it is, and over the long term, that's can only have a positive impact on the world, on them, on you, and etc. Yeah, and so too. Yeah, I think that's true. I just wanted to push you a little bit. Okay, I basically agree with you. But there's a lot of other cases where I don't know. I mean, I think if
Let's say if it happens, let's say here in synagogue, let's say Saturday, people coming, there's shul on Shabbat and everything, and there's a situation like that that is not appropriate. How do you approach it as a rabbi, for example?
So, I don't know what the example would be, but I think we have, there are a lot of people here who are not fully Shomer Shabbat or even a little bit Shomer Shabbat, but our doors are open to them, and I think the nature of this synagogue in this neighborhood, serving this broad community, is we're a Jewish resource for anyone who wants to use us as a resource, wherever they come from, whatever that means for them. So we don't ask people how they got here or where they're going afterwards, or but we just make sure that they aren't interfering in the sort of the way in which our services are proceeding. So,
Is that like an example of that would be the fact that the parking lot of the shul is closed on Shabbat, because if it was open, then it's inviting people to drive.
Yeah. So it's interesting,
Because you can park elsewhere, but you're providing.
I have a mentor whose synagogue has an open parking lot, and he just feels, look, they drive, and if they ask me is it permissible to drive, I'll tell them no. If they ask me, should I stay home Shabbat or drive to shul, I'll say stay home and read a book. And when you're ready, you'll move closer. You move closer if that's a priority for you. But they don't ask me, and they drive anyway. So why shouldn't I have the parking lot open? I'm not, what is that serving? The other argument is no. The parking lot is open. That's it's like you're there is no you're an enabler, or is it an enabler? They can park in my garage. It's hypocrisy, or it's. There's also the elements of you want to cultivate a certain it's a phrase one of my teachers coined. He called it something like plausible hypocrisy. There's a level of hypocrisy which is actually helpful, because it's about aspirations. It's about we're putting our best foot forward and trying to present an image of ourselves in a certain positive light. Plausible. There's a level in which you can do 10% better than you really are, and that's plausible hypocrisy. And so from that perspective as well, we close the parking lot, because that's a way of expressing our community's value that we don't drive on Shabbat, even though people who come to Shabbat morning, some significant percentage do drive on Shabbat. So the parking lot's closed is a way of showing that's not our ideals. Our ideal is not that, and the version of the Torah that we're teaching is not that. Even though we understand, again, our doors are open to everyone.
Is that like a gray area, or there's halakha, straight halakha that you're actually giving me that's the result of the debate?
No, parking lot. Look, most Orthodox shuls have closed parking lots on Shabbat, but
No, in general,
I think is that what?
the whole situation basically of like, let's say Shabbat, or if you have a guest coming and driving a Shabbat.
No, that's a machloket. That's a machloket. It's with the 20th century poskim. That Moshe Feinstein was very strict. Moshe Feinstein said a synagogue is not allowed to have youth programming if they think the kids will be driven to this, are going to be driven to the synagogue. Better not to have programming if the programming is going to be so popular that people will drive to shul. Because he felt like otherwise once you go down that route of, well, it's in their best interest, like don't play games with the Torah, don't think that you're smarter than Jewish law. Like, once you go down that route,
once you open the gate.
You're always going to compromise, and you're always going to justify and rationalize, and you'll have no principles left. On the other side, you have Tzitz Eliezer and Shlomo Arbach and others who say, no, look at the big picture of this person, and what's in their best interest religiously is being invited in and having those invitations. You're not on two different sides of the river. They can break Shabbos, so they don't need you to violate Shabbat in most cases. And most synagogues, I think, are a little bit, most Orthodox synagogues, the parking lot's closed. So, on the other hand, I've never heard of an Orthodox synagogue that refuses to send out a monthly schedule to somebody who lives more than 4 miles away. That's unheard of, right? You go through a mailing list. If you live too far, we're not going to send you. We're not going to invite you. We're not going to send you information about our programming. I've never heard of that. But the other, and in terms of, I would say also people in your house. I think the other value would be just maybe one day you'll have. Well, for say that children, but just for yourself, I think at some point your own experience of Shabbat is undermined by if everyone is sort of dropping in, dropping out, driving to and fro, that can, I think I'm going to dive in the shul, the big shul this afternoon. Thank you. That can undermine the sense of one of the nice things about Shabbat is everyone's here, nobody's any place to go, nobody's in a rush, nobody's looking at their watch to get to the next thing, except for me. It's not, and if that's, if you're staying put, but your guests are driving over for dinner and they drive out and they come back, so the other guests drive over for lunch, I think that may have a corrosive effect on your own experience of Shabbat or of your children, etc. So I don't think you necessarily want to have everyone every week driving in, but I think I don't look. I didn't grow up in a South urban home, and my personal life was very dramatically and positively changed by being invited to other people's homes for Shabbat meals on a number of occasions. So I see how that can make a difference, and so. And I also see how it's not enabling, like they can drive anywhere. But there are cases,
Just from an Israeli perspective, I think what you're saying is extremely, as an Israeli as well, probably in Israel it's usually all or nothing.
Yeah.
And here in America, there's much more of a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that actually enables,
Yeah.
you're talking about enabling people doing bad things,
Correct.
but actually enabling people to experience much more than they wouldn't otherwise, right? So there's two sides of this concept.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I actually think that there's bringing more people to experience much more than otherwise because
I agree. There was an Israeli organization called Beit Hillel, which published a halachic paper, the permissibility of inviting people to your home who or suspect are going to drive, and for this reason, we were trying to just encourage more Jews in Israel to come together for Shabbat.
It's by the way, it became a big trend over the last 5 years. I think people who are not secular, in the middle between secular and Orthodox, and it's becoming much more of a thing in the recent. I think 5-10 years.
I think you're right. I also think the Sephardic dynamic is a little bit different, where you might have very religious. You have the same family with like, one who goes to the soccer game, and one who goes to shul, and one who, has 10 piercings on each, eyebrow, and they all come together for Shabbat lunch. Right? I think that could be. I think that dynamic. I think is also more, sort of tolerance, or sort of like we can all, we all make our own choices, but we can still come together and celebrate like Shabbat. I think that's I think it's also a healthy thing actually. That tolerance and respect, mutual respect. There's another category of nisayeh, which is aiding or being involved in sin. That's something that's not technical lifnei iver, because you're not on two sides of the river. On one side of the river, there still might be a problem of nisayeh, of you're involved, you're implicated somehow, and they're doing something wrong. And there's another level, the worst of all, is mesit. Mesit is actually encouraging somebody else to do something wrong. That's like the worst of all. Not only you enabling, but you're encouraging. You're the cause. You're promoting, and that's even worse. So don't do any of those things. Okay. Again, like I just that could also be sometimes in we're not. Don't be cynical or mocking of other people's piety. I think that can also be really corrosive if somebody is a little more observant than you, a little more religious than you. They say, I'm not going to say lashon hara, or somebody takes a long time looking up in the book the bracha to say before eating a grapefruit. Don't make jokes. Don't tease. And that can be really corrosive in a community where breeds cynicism. Like nobody cares about this, and you're the weird one. And even if it's true that nobody else cares, if it's true, it might be true that in this particular segment of the community, this particular mitzvah is not observed very carefully, but respect, give honor and respect to somebody who is being conscientious about something, and don't make yourself feel better by knocking them down, because that type of cynicism is really, really corrosive to a community, and it hurts people, and it's like, build each other up, don't tear each other down. Okay, I think we'll pause here. Next is blessings. We'll do some philosophical topics, and we might finish up. I don't have my phone there, so I left it on my desk. We'll stay tuned to the bulletin. Is that okay for the next time the class meets? I don't. My schedule's a little bit erratic. The next few weeks we've had some babysitter cancellations and my kids' school schedule, but it will either be next week, maybe the week after, and then we'll do the and yeah. Okay. So.
I guess one will you let somebody know, then they'll just transfer it. Yeah. Oh, in your bulletin?
It'll be in the bulletin.
Oh.
Every week you have to. I want to encourage you in the bulletin. Very carefully. Is that right?
I didn't notice.
Okay. It's always in the bulletin.
Oh.
All right. Or on the website. Okay.